So I'm going to try to fit a whole lot into this. So forgive me if I'm trying to go quickly, but part of the disclaimer is that I wrote a very long paper about this, a very, very long paper by threat intel standards that I expect nobody to read. I think some of you already have, and my most sincere apologies. The paper is super long. It covers a bunch of stuff. Like, I actually indulge and went into like the epistemology of the cyber domain and like institutional attribution problems, and there's pretentious quotes in it and adversary configuration and a ton of references, and there's like words that Brian doesn't like, and just a lot. So this is a short and sweet version, and I'm going to try to cover as much as I can in it. If there's something I don't cover very well, it might be in the paper, or I might lie to you and tell you that's in the paper just to avoid difficult questions. So let's talk about APTs. The subject matter overall is sort of complex and fascinating, and it garners immediate attention, which is why I think a lot of us tend to be focused on this instead of, say, e-crime or some of the other research that we could be doing. It also means that the topic of APTs is often very contrived, it's oversimplified, and it's problematically static. And that's something that I really want to focus on, this shift from a static research output to hopefully a more dynamic way of going about things. So please keep that in mind as a general theme. My biggest issue and what started the writing of this paper was the term sophisticated. I think we've all gotten exhausted of the notion of saying that something is sophisticated. Oh, the most sophisticated APT, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes we might mean it. I'm sure that when it first started was because some analyst looked at something and went, oh my God, this is amazing. But from that point forward, it's really just sort of lost all notion of what the word sophisticated is supposed to mean. It was supposed to be exalted. We've kind of lost that. And more often than not, now that we talk about sophistication when it comes to APTs, what we want is just to get free PR and say, hey, you should write about this thing. And this happens more in the incident response stage, you basically want to say that this is equated to an act of God. It was so, they're so amazing that you getting breached by these guys, I mean, nobody could have stopped them. And more often than not, that's not true. However, it's not enough to complain about the word sophisticated. I've been in those rooms full of researchers, a lot of whom are here, where we're all, rolling our eyes to the notion of sophistication, but we keep using the word. And I think that speaks to a deficiency in our language overall. We know that this isn't an accurate way to represent things, but we don't necessarily have the correct language or general methodology to move away from that binary exaltation. So I wanted to kind of shift our focus of how we describe adversaries overall. Right now, a big part of the problem, and maybe it doesn't look like that much of a problem to a DC audience, is that we're deriving a lot of our concepts from this sort of military doctrine. And a lot of people came out of the State Department or the State Department and a lot of other places that tend to think on these terms. And it tends to have certain expectations, right? You're talking about a static adversary. The configurations of the possible adversaries tend to be very doctrinarian. You're thinking about, other military or intelligence organizations. It sort of really constricts what you're going to be looking at. It tends to imply a certain set of conventional thinking and logistics as to what a threat actor does, how they're composed, where they're going to go, what they're willing to do. And it tends to imply rational incentives by the strictest definition, which isn't really the case for the most part. So I wanted to discuss what a possible alternative could be. And not quite, right? So not CSI Cyber, but kinda. I never watched the show, to be honest with you. I'm sure that it was atrocious. But my idea was to sort of try to take over something like criminal behavioral profiling, right? Like the kind of thing that television has also ruined for us, but that if you look at it from a standard, a definition of what that discipline is supposed to be, it's supposed to describe unknown perpetrators. The idea is to forecast risk based on behaviors, on traits, on targeting and procedures. And the output, the intention of criminal behavioral profiling is to provide an output to help guide investigations. So is that something that can sound familiar? Is it sort of a framework that might work for us? I think we're going to find a lot of similar terms. So as far as criminal behavior profiling, there's no way I'm going to accurately describe this discipline within the short amount of time that I have. So I'm just going to make kind of a scarecrow out of it, of what it's composed of, so that I can bastardize it in order to use it for cyber threat actors. But the main operating thesis is this: behavior reflects personality. So even though you don't know who the perpetrator of a crime is, being able to observe their behavior, be able to catalog what they do in a scene, in a place, at a sort of ritual pattern, allows you to have a semblance, and a notion of who they are and what they're like and what they know. So the primary goal of criminal behavior profiling, if the clicker agrees with me, is it attributing? No, it absolutely has nothing to do with attribution, and I think that's something important for us. Because at the end of the day, when you actually sort of take on the notion of a profiler, there is no point at which you're supposed to, come out with a smoking gun and say, my profile says that it was so-and-so. The notion is actually to create a testable hypothesis and a notion of whom you might be dealing with. The idea is that attribution is not up to the profilers. Instead, the goal is just to generate hypotheses that are going to narrow nominal pools. For those of you who might not be as aware of what a nominal pool is, I wasn't when I first started this thing. It's just, think of a database or something where you've got 2 million names, and you have to find a way to keep shrinking that pool to say, hey, yeah, we might have 2 million people in the UK, but they probably live in London, and they probably work at a steel mill, and you just kind of keep narrowing a profile down that takes 2 million to 2,000 and sort of gives you something to work with. Now, the idea is that these testable profiles are supposed to adapt to new information. They're supposed to compensate for bias, which is something really important for us. I know Bart in the crowd has done a lot of education for people to sort of think about sort of bias and compensate for it as the way that traditional intelligence analysts might, but threat intel analysts usually don't. And I think this is really important. They're supposed to expect further incidents. I think a big problem with our research output right now is that we tend to put out things that treat the research as if publication means that this is going to stop. We have put a period at the end of this operation. That's almost never the case. So what would it look like to kind of adapt this notion of behavioral profiling specifically for cyber threat actors? Well, we can take that original operating thesis and adapt it a little bit and say operational behavior and tooling reflects adversarial configuration and imperatives. And I think that tends to be kind of important because there's a lot of that we're already observing. We already have a lot of that on hand. We're just not necessarily putting it together in the right way. So instead of identifying a person or an institution, the idea is that we would create a more dynamic and testable profile based on concrete research observations. Like I said, a lot of this stuff we're already seeing. We tend to be familiar with what programming languages are being used to program something, what size of development resources might be involved, what kind of tasking behaviors, cleanup behaviors, et cetera. We've already seen these things. And I think that it's important to focus on what the adversarial configuration can be, because a lot of the time, especially now in the age of leaks, which we've discussed a lot today, we tend to be satisfied with the idea of knowing that it's a certain country or that it's a certain institution. And that's an oversimplification that leads us to disaster. Just because you think you know it's the IRGC or it's the FSB, that doesn't actually take you anywhere. If anything, it tends to derail your investigation because there are all these notions of what these institutions act like, none of which are really accurate, at least not from a layman's perspective. So the truth is that there really aren't that many possible adversary configurations, at least not from the perspective of outsiders observing these things. So I think the main differentiator that we can latch onto is the notion of externality versus internalization, right? What parts of an operation and what parts of a threat actor are internal to the main body or externalized, outsourced, as previous speakers discussed today. That gives you a series of different configurations, the clicker's being a little weird, but some of the ways that we can start to think about this is, for example, instead of saying a nation-state group, a lot of what we tend to be talking about is the tasking or the targeting internal or external. And that's really your main difference between saying, is this an arm of a state organization or a mercenary group, right? You can also, instead of saying something like well-resourced, which we tend to talk about with all the exploits and so on, I think a lot of what we're trying to hone in on is, are we talking about, what kind of a tool development cycle are we talking about? Is the tooling internal or external? Are they buying this stuff? Are they pirating this stuff? Are they buying it off the shelf? Are they developing it themselves? Is it from a defense contractor? I mean, it tells you a lot of different things about a group. And to kind of take a lot of that information and sort of condense it a bit, when we're talking about this sort of access to resources, some of the indications that you might see as far as like internal maintenance, development, and so on tends to come from, for example, internally, a lot of off-the-shelf malware, a lot of customized open source malware, or maybe pirated stuff that's beyond support, or NJRAT and that kind of stuff. A lot of self-managed infrastructure, which has gotten a lot of people into trouble, right? I think the idea is generally, hey, an intelligence agency says we're going to have everything in-house so we can trust our people and none of our stuff's going to leak. Sure, but how much talent do you really have internally? And does that mean that when somebody goes investigating your operation, all of a sudden they find it all calling back to a server within your organization and sort of lay the entire thing bare for somebody else? It happens. Dark Caracal is a really good example of that. Externality when it comes to tooling or externalization, a lot of it we've already discussed with sort of like these mid-level contractors like Hacking Team and Gamma Group and NSO, which is very popular these days. There's another level that I think is very interesting, probably the favorite, but that doesn't tend to get discussed this way, which is the kind of stuff that you outsource to military defense contractors, is sort of like multi-million-dollar frameworks that only certain organizations can buy. And they tend to be very quality assured and amazing to research, but most people don't like to touch that stuff. You also see a notion of automated infrastructure management, a lot of anonymization that tends to happen managed by a third party, a third source, that's sort of making sure that these chains of command and control servers, or that these chains of different points at which you can connect out to these servers are not going to lead back to where you're conducting your operations. That kind of stuff tends to be managed by a third party if it's being done well. Like I said, anonymization infrastructure. Another way to look at it as far as resources go is a notion of a zero-day burn rate. So most of the time we get very excited about finding an O-Day and we go and we publish it right away, and that's proof that these guys are sophisticated or well-resourced or probably a nation state. And that's cool and all, but I think that we've been around for long enough where we're starting to see threat actors who tend to have not just a 0-day or 2 0 days, but actually a cycle of burning 0 days. And they might be particularly interesting about how they dispense with these. They might be particularly interesting about what they do once one of them gets burned. And that tells you a lot about what those resources might be, whether it's having somebody in-house who happens to be particularly good with a certain set of vulnerabilities and exploits, or whether they just have this pool of money that is not being controlled, and it's you need to assure access, so burn, burn, burn as long as you're continuing to have your access. Instead of sophisticated, the eye-rolling word that got all of this started, I think that a lot of what we tend to be talking about is how many mistakes and how much automation we're seeing with a lot of these things, right? Sophistication sort of tends to stand at the other end of the spectrum of what are laughable operations, things, people making really stupid mistakes, rudimentary things, malware that doesn't work, misconfigured servers, blah, 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 blah. Now, rolling all that back into the notion of a sort of a testable profile, just in what we've been describing, think about it from the perspective of doing the research on these threat actors and the fact that a lot of these things tend to already be visible in the terms of proficiencies and deficiencies. What were they good at? What did they do well? What don't they do well? Where do they make mistakes? Where do they recurringly make mistakes, and so on? It has to do, you can essentially fold all that into this notion of TTPs that we already discussed, but that we don't really discuss on those terms anymore. We've boiled it down to IOCs, and that's so sort of static and flimsy that we're no longer profiling how these threat actors operate. Now, why is a dynamic profile important? Again, remember this notion of dynamism versus having static notions of our adversaries. The big thing is that threat actors change, and sometimes they change radically. Think about Kurt's talk earlier with all the Russian groups and how we're starting to see this sort of general shift between them. Think about, the talk that's coming after this, black energy going into gray energy, even the talk that, with all of the slide flickering that I was terrified of, the idea of what's been happening with someone like Berserk Bear from 2015 and onwards. You're talking about an object of study that's mutable by definition. And if threat actors can change, it means that the research output that we're producing has to be changeable, testable, adaptable in order to help people. A lot of the factors that might, lend to that, if you think about it from a nation-state perspective or what might compose these groups, developers and operators defect, they retire, they die, they leave, they get more lucrative jobs. Some of these groups are subject to geopolitical tensions and schisms. You have code bases that get repackaged or resold, especially when it comes to some of these mid-tier developers like Hacking Team and so on. What's to keep them from selling to another government? Everything starts to look like a certain cluster of things that weren't meant to be together, so on and so forth. Threat actors get breached by other threat actors. If you ever want to have a conversation about, fourth party collection and so on, there's another really boring paper you can read. Hack and leak ops, which we've discussed plenty today. There's also this notion, which I've been kind of terrified of for a long time, but I haven't really seen it happen, which is a notion of voluntarily open sourcing your toolkit. This is something that I expected to happen with Sophisy when things went really crazy over the past 2 years. One of the worst wrenches they could have thrown in our path would have just been to open source Xagent, open source some of the most common malware, and then hide in the massive misattributory noise of all these script kiddies using the same tools. Thankfully, they didn't do it, but it's definitely something that we wouldn't necessarily get a warning sign in the beginning as much as just see, oh, Sophisy is very prolific all of a sudden. Then other dynamics that we might not necessarily be privy to immediately, like resources suddenly become abundant. You go from being one of these groups in some underdeveloped nation that had 5 folks that could run operations on their own with crappy tooling to, hey, you're being successful, here's $2 million, go buy Hacking Team. And it's important to remember that that's not a move that only goes in one direction. After a couple of years, they say, hey, you know what? We don't have that much money in the bank. You're not doing that well. Cut the contract with Hacking Team, and you're going back to whatever tools you have. So there's definitely a development cycle, and threat actors live and breathe and change over time, and so must our research output. So like I said, if the object of study is mutable by definition, then the output of our research must be adaptable. And I think that's particularly important when we think about who this research is for. Even though there's a group of us here, a lot of us know each other, and we, when I present some of this stuff, I get excited to show it to my friends who understand it, who might be particularly excited, who might be proud of the stuff that we found. But the truth is that threat intelligence isn't really meant for that, nor is it meant for the Twitter peanut gallery. And a lot of times it isn't even meant for, government consumption as much as defenders to defend networks that are under siege. And if that's the case, then it's got to feel horrible to be part of a network that's being hit by actor A. And then, all of us descend down the mountain and go, hey, this is actor A month, and all of us are going to publish on this thing, and then, we've moved on. We're tired of it. We've already, everybody did APT-10 last year. We're not doing this anymore. That defender is still dealing with the exact same threat. All of our research was really useful for a period of 2 months, and then all of a sudden, unless you've got $100,000 burning a hole in your pocket, nobody's coming to your aid anymore. So it definitely, having a shelf life on threat intelligence is actually, I don't know if it's entirely avoidable, but I think we could definitely do more to expand what that shelf life would entail. So the idea would be to provide the best possible advantage to those with a vested interest, which means, people that are actually actively defending from some of these infections, and to provide a research output that's actually designed to be competently continued by others. And I think that's where we get into a lot of trouble. We don't like to reveal our sources. We don't like to point specific data out. We usually just hash dump or don't dump any IOCs at all. And we don't tell people what led us to make our conclusions. So then when I'm done and it gets handed over to a contractor, to somebody consulting, or to the poor 2 schmucks who work in that company and need to further defend from that threat, they're actually no better equipped to continue that research. They might be able to say, yeah, we're definitely getting hit by APT-10, but that's the end of the help that we've provided them. So I did a similar talk for VB when I first published the paper, and I didn't get to go into any examples. How's my time? Can anybody? I'm all right? Okay, so I wanted to actually get to go into one of the examples, because then in that conference, all I did was say, hey, go read the paper, which of course nobody did. And we're in DC, so I feel like I could do something a little more specific. So let's talk about the Lamberts, which is, for anybody who doesn't know, probably the most fascinating threat actor you will ever look at, or at least one of them. It is by far one of my favorite threat actors. It's not about sophistication, but I will gush about them for a while up here. Anybody whose work this is, good job. All right, a little history on the Lamberts. It was discovered because FireEye discovered a 0-day, and then for some reason FireEye didn't find it very interesting, but Kaspersky and Symantec continued to find it interesting, and they did a lot of very good work on it. I was there when they did it. I'm not absolving myself of it. I continue to love the Lamberts to this day. Now, why focus on them? Because they're fascinating, because they're unique, because they're taboo, but really because they're fascinating, because there is something to be said about what we could do with profiling here that hasn't been done. Not even by what Kaspersky published, or especially what Symantec published, or definitely not what FireEye published, because they only published on the 0-day and didn't say what the payload was. So what's the problem? The problem is Vault 7. The problem is that at the same time that information became more or less public about this unbelievable threat actor, Vault 7 came around, Symantec tied the Lamberts to Vault 7, everybody said, oh, we know what organization is involved in this. And not only did people stop researching it for whatever reason, but also it also gives you this false notion that you know what's happening because you believe you know what organization is involved. Happened with Equation, happens with Sophisy and Turla and all these groups that people seem to think they understand because it's the same thing that we were arguing about 3 years ago when we were talking about, oh, Lazarus Group, well, we know what North Korea acts like. Any international relations students or geopolitics students in the room should know that is a ridiculous notion to say this country is a homogeneous entity that has certain very obvious operating procedures. So if we can move away from that notion and actually, move away from institutional attribution and move away from this notion of oversimplification, I wanted to just point out some key insights about the Lamberts that I hope bring about sort of just a general example of what we could be doing with these threat actors. So in this case, what we're missing out on with those oversimplifications is what it looks like for a threat actor to develop and maintain multiple modular frameworks simultaneously. That is particularly rare. Even with amazing threat actors like Equation that have been operating for possibly 20 years and have had amazing, really expensive modular frameworks, they don't usually maintain them at the same time. One of them goes up, then it goes down, the next one comes up, you've got some semblance of transition, but you're not spending $5 million on each at the same time just for the hell of it. The Lamberts do that. It's a threat actor that doesn't wait to be burned in order to retool. It's a threat actor that does not maintain superfluous infections, which is particularly interesting because if you think about it, there's not a 1-to-1 ratio of whether you hit the right target. So most threat actors will go and infect somebody in the outside office and then somebody in the inside office and then maybe the person that they wanted, and they'll keep all those infections lying around. The Lamberts don't do that. It's also really interesting to see an advanced threat actor, a sophisticated threat actor, that would shirk large-scale infection automation and still continue to do hands-on manual operations. Again, very rare. What that means is covertness is so paramount. The combination of all these things mean that covertness is so paramount to this threat actor that it's worthy of extensive and redundant investment. Even for the threat actors who are spending a ton of money, that's not common. So why are the Lamberts so noteworthy? They've essentially perfected operational segmentation. If you can think about the different categories that we were discussing for different threat actors, we talked about resources and tooling, we were talking about operational capabilities, automation, and so on, and tasking. And those things tend to come from different places or be treated in different ways. And I feel like not only have they divided it properly, but they've essentially given each piece to the best possible specialist for this thing. So the tool development is specialized, it's custom, it's done in parallel. The operations are manual, they're carried out with enough specialization to avoid most countermeasures, collections, or consistent clustering, which means that it's not particularly easy to research this, guys. And there's a sort of pinhole tasking that tends to indicate extensive familiarity with the target organization or individuals, which again is rare. From a profiler standpoint, it's not an interesting institution. I think for historians, it'll always be an interesting institution. But from the perspective of cyber threat profiling, the notion is that we're looking at a harbinger of what a true apex threat actor should, will, does look like. And maybe that's not relevant for most threat actors today, but give it another 2 years, 5 years, 10 years of this escalating conflict and this notion that people are going to continue to trickle down capabilities, and then it'll be quite interesting. So other fragmentary examples that you can look at for in the paper, a lot of interesting stuff. Sorry. If you feel like reading a really long, boring paper, bit.ly cyber in all caps. Cyber. And that's it. I don't know how, but I completed it on time. Done.
With the idea of the dynamic profiling, how does that fit into sort of some of the existing frameworks that we use today, like attack or any of these others? Do you see a match there?
To be honest with you, I feel like relying on any of those frameworks is moving even farther in the wrong or opposite direction. I'm not a fan of the frameworks. I'm also not a fan of a lot of the sort of thinking tools that most people like the, forgive me, Sergio, I don't like the diamond model. I don't like the, cyber kill chain trademark. I don't like a lot of these things because I think that if anything, I'm hoping that we as analysts will get more engaged, whereas a lot of these frameworks, what they're trying to do is find a way to turn aspects of an operation into piecemeal things that you can put into a platform, and then you go in and you see a bunch of tags and it's like infection vector was this, and the malware is that family, and it's just removing you farther and farther away from the notion of understanding how the threat actor acts, what they do, what some of their general techniques, procedures, and so on might be. So I'm really not fond of it. I think it also tends to inspire a certain notion of complacency. I understand, I've already tagged this actor 2 years ago. I'm done. And, I understand why we need it. I understand that there are different maturity levels and consumers are going to want different things, and we need to make things sort of palatable and digestible. But I'm hoping that the research community that is actually outputting things will kind of resist the temptation to sort of spoon feed all this stuff at such a granular level. Sorry for any fans of attack and stuff. I know that it's like the latest hotness, but I don't like it.